All right. Oh, it's caught on something. So like Jeremy said, I'm Jacob, and I'm teaching tonight on the subject of peer pressure. In all of our relationships, I mean, obviously, I'm sure you guys have experienced peer pressure at some point. I know I have. It's a natural part of having friends in this world, you know. But whether or not it's a healthy or an unhealthy friendship, a lot of times you can tell that through what they're pressuring you into. As a lot of you have already commented or noticed, I'm wearing a Shrek shirt. Shrek is one of my favorite movies. I used to watch it all the time with my grandparents growing up. It's great. If you haven't seen it, ask your parents first. That's all I'm going to say. But raise your hand if you've seen Shrek before. Awesome. So just as a brief recap for anyone who's forgotten or hasn't seen it, Shrek is a big green ogre who likes to live alone in his swamp and no one bothers him, so he can sit on his couch and do whatever he wants. Sounds like a really nice life sometimes. What happens is there's a little short guy named Lord Farquaad who's the enemy in this story, and he's trying to capture all the fairy tale creatures and send them away because he doesn't want the land to have fairy tale creatures. But there's one character in the show, or in the movie, named Donkey. He's this little guy right there. He's a pretty funny guy. But if you couldn't imagine, his name is Donkey because he's a donkey, and he's a talking donkey. In one of the early on scenes, Donkey's captured by Lord Farquaad, and they're trying to take him to the camp or prison or whatever they're taking him to. However, Shrek goes in and saves Donkey, and so then Donkey attaches himself at the hip to Shrek and just says, "You know what? You saved me. I'm going to be your friend regardless of what you do to me," which does not go too well for Donkey in the first few minutes of the movie. For anyone who's remembered, Shrek keeps telling him, "Go away. No, I don't want to be your friend," and just all around bullying him. Which is not great. But while Donkey is hurt by these words and what Shrek's doing to him, he doesn't really care because he feels like deep down he's incapable of making other friends. All of his life he's been told that he's annoying or just kind of dumb, and so no one wants to be his friend. So when you find Shrek and thinks Shrek cares about him at least a little bit, regardless of what Shrek says to him, he attaches and tries to stay. As a disclaimer, later on in the movie, obviously Shrek changes. We're not going to talk about Shrek changing into a good person. Hopefully all of your friends are good people. But just so you know, that happens later on. And it becomes a good story where they're happy and healthy friends. But we're speaking more about the beginning of the movie. So how often do we relate to Donkey's story? How often do we feel trapped in our friendships, whether they're toxic or unhealthy, just because either we feel like we owe it to those people or because we fear the thought of not having any friends? You know, we're worried that if we leave these friends behind because they're bad influencers or just all around mean to us, you know, we might be afraid of not having other friends if we leave them behind. So tonight we're going to be talking about the concept of healthy and unhealthy friendships through looking at the story of three guys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because I don't like saying long names, I'm going to use their names from the VeggieTales story called Rack, Shack, and Benny. Raise your hand if you've seen that one too. Awesome. We love VeggieTales. I grew up on it. It's good. So for those of you who haven't read the story before or haven't seen the movie, I'm going to catch you guys up a little bit. The story takes place in the book of Daniel, which is towards the middle of the Old Testament. It's a historical book, so it tells the history of Israel and its people. It takes place about 600 years before Jesus was born, and it takes place in the town of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon at that time. Babylon was the name of the capital and of the kingdom. So similar to like New York City, New York State, Babylon City, Babylon Kingdom. So that's why you'll hear a lot of Babylon tonight. So King Nebuchadnezzar had captured the city of Jerusalem during his conquest to increase the size of the Babylonian Empire. And he had this habit of taking some of the best, strongest, wisest men from each town that he conquered back to their capital so that they can grow as a kingdom in wisdom and strength. And they're trying to make them into these model Babylonian citizens. Rakshak and Benny, otherwise known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were taken along with their friend Daniel, after whom the book is named after. You've probably heard of Daniel as well. Thrown into lion's den, you know, all that good stuff. So that's kind of the context of where we're at. These three guys and their other buddy Daniel taken into captivity from their hometown of Jerusalem to Babylon so that they can be smart and wise and try to help Babylon increase in size and strength. Nebuchadnezzar had this thing that he liked to be worshipped, as a lot of old kings and emperors did. They like to make their people think of themselves as a god of sorts. Because if you think that your king is a god, you're less likely to revolt against him. You know, it's kind of a losing battle if you think you're fighting God. So Nebuchadnezzar liked people to worship him. So he had a great, giant golden statue built as a sign of his greatness. And he commanded all the people in the land to bow down and worship this statue. And that anyone who didn't got thrown into what was referred to as the blazing hot furnace. So just imagine getting thrown into a really big fire or the lake of lava in the end of Lord of the Rings. That's kind of like what I think about because it's hot. But the heroes in our story refused to bow down and worship anything other than the one true God. And when word got back of this to the king, King Nebuchadnezzar was furious, and he had them brought before him for them to either be convinced into worship or to be executed. So this is where we're going to pick up the stories. So now you know the background. These three guys taken into captivity, told to worship this thing. They said no. King Nebuchadnezzar said, all right, come here, I'm going to talk to you. So I think you all have a Bible, or most of you have a Bible. We're going to open up to the book of Daniel, which is in the Old Testament. That's Daniel chapter 3. It's kind of a long section, so you'll have to bear with me for a little bit of the story here. Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 30. Give me a thumbs up when you're there. What's the page number in those Bibles? 523. So the book is in 523 in most of the Bibles that are on your chairs. All right. So Daniel, and if you haven't found it, it's also up on the screens because that's really handy. So again, this is Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 30. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to Nebuchadnezzar, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship that gold statue you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and then he ordered some of his strongest men in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. So just kind of recap what this was. They said, we're not worshiping you. Regardless, either God will protect us or he won't. It doesn't matter. We're going to only worship God. Nothing you can do to us will change that fact. And obviously Nebuchadnezzar got mad. When it says he made a face of rage, I like to picture the live-action Grinch, just like one of those weird faces he makes, curled up into a face of rage. So he told them to go. His soldiers bound them up and threw them into the furnace. It heated up super hot enough that the people who were throwing them in died instantly. And to die from heat, it has to be pretty hot. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown in fully clothed as they went before the king, and just their normal everyday clothes. It's not like firefighter outfits or anything like that to help protect them. It was just like if one of you got thrown into a fire right now in your sweatpants and t-shirts. All right, picking back up in verse 24. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could, my bookmark got in the way, as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, nor their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god other than their own God. Therefore, I will make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. So again, to recap that last part, Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fire and said, hey, wait a second, we put 3 guys in there. How is there 4? And so then he called them out. And all of a sudden they came out. Remember, this is the same fire that people died just by going close to. They came out, their hair was fine, their clothes were fine, they didn't even smell of smoke. You can be within a campfire of like 20 feet away from you, Anyone who's gone camping or Boy Scouts, I'm sure you've realized at the end of the night, if you had a fire, regardless of where you were sitting, you smell like smoke, and that's not a hot fire. And so Nebuchadnezzar brought them out and then sent out a decree saying that no one could speak against his God, against their God, and that anyone who speaks against them will be executed and their house will be destroyed. And then, not only that, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were promoted to higher positions. Obviously, this is a pretty best-case scenario when we're talking about peer pressure. Not every situation in our lives will go that well for us. That's just a fact. But obviously, from this story, it went well for them. So, as I said earlier, all of us have experienced peer pressure to some degree in our lives. This could have come through areas ranging from, dressing a certain way or bullying people to seem cool, forming cliques and ignoring other people just because, you want to fit in with your current friends, so you have to ignore the people that they don't like, abusing drugs and alcohol, or like going too far with your boy or girlfriend. We can get pressured to do a lot of things just in our daily, everyday lives. But when we get pressured to do things against what God desires for our lives, we need to make sure that we're refocusing on Him and make the decision of what we value more in that moment. Do we value whatever that momentary pleasure is that is coming up on us that might have long-term negative consequences, or do we value pleasing God? So in our reading above, Rakshak and Benny were literally willing to die before giving into the pressure to worship anything other than God. I'm sure that when they appeared before Nebuchadnezzar, it probably wasn't the first time that they were told to worship the statue. I'm trying to think of a good example in current day, but if the government says you need to do something, I'm sure a lot of people were telling them to do that same thing as well. I'm sure a lot of their friends were like, hey, if you don't do this, you're going to die. They're going to execute you. They're going to do bad things to you. If you don't just bow down, worship. You don't have to actually worship. Just bow down, make it look like you are, and you'll be fine. And these friends were probably really persistent and really aggressive in trying to get them to worship that statue. And yet they didn't give in. They stayed strong against the peer pressure. And when we choose something that our friends want us to do, so say that they had given in to worshiping the statue, they knew that it goes against what God wanted them to do, but through that action, they would have basically been telling God that we love whatever action that we did, and we love our friends more than we love Him who created us. And we're more willing to worship that than we are to accept His love and worship God, which is not a good look, I'm going to be honest. But when we resist this temptation of peer pressure, we can know that God will be there to support us in our efforts to follow Him. In the story we read, Nebuchadnezzar looks into the fire and sees a fourth person. And he says, what is that? We put 3 people in there. When we're trying to follow what God wants us to do, even if it's really hard and even if it's really scary, like I'm sure I would have been scared getting thrown into a fire, God sent an angel to help them. It might not be a physical guy comes standing next to us and holds out a sword and says, away, temptress, but, we'll get support from God. Because they loved Him and He loved them, and He wanted to help them in their desire to stand strong for what God wanted them to do. And not only that, but like we saw in the end of the story, when we stand strong and resist to the pressure to give in, not only do we please God, but we can also unknowingly be witnessing to the people trying to pressure us into doing bad things. If your friend, or let me think, I'm trying to think, I think we were talking about it in a staff meeting or something recently. I don't even remember where the line came from, but someone said something to the tune of, our life needs to exhibit faith that demands an explanation. When we're living our lives, when we're going to school, when we're, just hanging out in our room at home, what are we doing that would be different and set us apart from those around us? Whatever we're doing needs to be so radically different that people wonder why we're like that. We need to be able to witness to people around us just by resisting temptation to do things that go against God's will. So next I'm going to read a verse from Galatians 1:10. Let me open my Bible here. I put a little bookmark in here so I would be quick. So Galatians 1:10, it might be on the screen, I can't remember more or not. Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. If it is our desire to be servants of Christ, we need to ensure that we're following His commands and following His wishes, and that needs to be our first priority, not whatever is popular or cool or whatever we're getting pressured into. I was trying to find a fun acronym that would help us remember steps to avoid peer pressure, and the only acronym I found is very dated. Who here has heard the word swag before? Who here still uses the word swag? Pastor Jeremy, yeah. So the acronym is SWAG, to help us avoid peer pressure. So what this means is S stands for stop and say no. W says wait. A, avoid the situation and offer, oh, I'm going way too fast. S is stop and say no. W is to wait and consider what would happen. A is to avoid the situation and offer alternatives, not avoid the alternatives. That's okay. Avoid the situation, so like if your friends are trying to get you to do something, say, no, how about we go do this? You know, it's the same thing that you do with babies. If a baby is crying and wants something, you redirect the attention somewhere else, you know? That way it's not, you're just changing what's going on and not giving into the situation. And finally, if none of that works, get out, which is a lot easier said than done. It's not always just like, oh, this is bad. I'm just going to walk away and nothing bad is going to happen to me because I'm walking away. You know, when you leave a situation that people are trying to get you to do something, it's probably not going to be easy. It's probably going to be really uncomfortable. But when people try to pressure us into doing things that we know go against what God wants us to do, we need to stop them and say no, avoid the situation, offer alternatives, and if all else fails, leave. When we cannot change the subject or it begins hard to resist, we need to run and get out. When you're facing temptation, the best way to get out of that temptation is to leave the temptation. You know, like there's, I'm trying to think of, so for example, if you're someone who struggles with alcohol, you know, it's probably not a wise idea to go hang out around your friends who are drinking while you're trying to not drink, you know? Because if you're there and it's present and it's in front of you, you're more likely to give in to that pressure. The last verse that we're going to read for tonight is Proverbs 1:10, which I also have a little bookmark. Proverbs 1:10 says, "My child, if sinners entice you, turn your back on them." It's a really short way of saying, and a lot of really easy way of saying, you know, if someone tries to get you to sin, turn your back on them and run away. You know, don't just walk away. Run, flee from that temptation. We don't desire to be people pleasers, but rather we are on the path of becoming servants of Christ. Another really strong thing we get from this story is not only do we need to focus on turning away from our bad friends, but we need to find our Rack, Shack, and Benny. You know, one of the best ways to resist negative peer pressure or negative temptations of any sort is to find friends who will help support your resolve to follow God, even to the point of being thrown in a furnace together. You know, I got a group of guys, I'm in a group chat, and whenever something comes up that's temptation or pressure to do something that we know goes against God, we send a message to the chat and we pray for each other, and we hold each other accountable for that. You know, it's not always an easy thing to send a message when you're dealing with something, but it's so worth it when you're able to follow God and stay on that path. And so you need to find these friends and you need to find these mentors, whether that's here at youth group or if you have, you know, your parents or if you have other Christian friends, find those people and keep each other in the loop with the areas that you're struggling in. And also, not only just talk about your struggles, but offer or talk about your successes. You know, encourage each other in that it is possible to follow God. It is possible to do what He wants us to do. It is possible to resist temptation. But yeah, so we just need to make sure that when we're facing peer pressure, we get out of it. You know, we need to follow God above all else. If you have yet to lean into this God who will always be there with you and support you through the hard times in life, come and talk to one of your leaders, talk to Jeremy, talk to Megan, you know, talk to any of the volunteers here. We'd love to help you find the God we serve and find the God who we want to follow. And we'd love to help you discover that and start a relationship with Him. But that's all I got for you guys.